Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. Each episode we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking. Today I'm talking to my colleague here at the university, Sonal Khullar, and she had published actually a few years ago a fantastic new book on Indian modernist painters. Many ways her work overlaps with mine, and I thought I would ask her a series of questions on how she understands modernism, both as a practice and as an aesthetic institution. I hope you enjoy this conversation. It's a bit long, so let's get to it. First of all, welcome to Architecture Talk. It seems like to set up at high level, I mean, there is of course Partha Mitter's, high level sketch history of modern art, modern art in India, which you both refer to and disagree with in its sort of its outlines, where it seems like for Partha Mitter, before 1947 and after 1947, there's a radical break and a rupture, which you contest.
Yes.
And you say that no, indeed, that there's a certain kind of a being in the world, or a sense of making oneself in the world through practices of what we will discuss, the concept of affiliation, which you describe in the work of Amrita Sher Gill, and then you pick up again in Maqbool Fida Hussain and presumably in the others. So there is this sort of a chronology which you are both repeating and yet contesting as articulated in Partha Mitter, yes?
Yes, absolutely.
You are in that sense, from what I take it, articulating a historical temporality which emphasizes some ideas of repetition with change. I think your phrase is continuity with change. And you speak around that idea in using many different metaphors, and I'll come back to that. I'm very interested in haunting and so on. But let's first turn back to what I think is one of your key contentions about, what was it to be a practicing painter, modernist painter, before or after 1947. And it seems to me you're putting a lot of money on your reading of Edward Said's notion of affiliation, which is in your title, Worldly Affiliation. Worldly affiliation versus filiation, which is sort of a promising fiduciary duty, let's say, to a certain origin or paternity or whatever it is. It's an affiliation, right? Sort of an affiliation to a way of being in the world, or a recognition of being in the world, which is, it seems to me you are saying, and you're using term worlding quite a lot. Worldly affiliation, you say what's your title? Worldly affiliations. But you mean worldly also in this, you quoted Spivak by saying being in the world also, sort of it's a way of being in the world, right? And that the art practice recognizes, and you want to be very attentive to the artist, how he and she be in the world. Yeah, I'm picking up all these sort of concepts. So affiliation, which also therefore connects it to affiliating to contemporary practices, whether they're in Paris or wherever, but also then, let's say, a Janta or the street painters or the villages or the Nehruvian dialectic or Gandhi, etc. Yeah? And this is what I take it you describe as the modernist world. It's being modernist. So I was teaching my seminar on Indian modernism last week. 5 students like you in my seminar. And I'm talking about this and I'm talking about that. And they're like, yeah, but you haven't told us what makes this Indian. Right? You're talking about debates and contentions and this and that and how they do this. So where do you stand on that question finally in the people that you're looking at in this book? Being modern in India means looking at some Indian things but being worldly, cosmopolitan? Or is there a sort of an Indian, can that question be answered? Is there an Indian to the Indian modernism?
Oh, I definitely think there are historical and political and cultural specificities to modernism in India. I think that previous generations of scholars who've worked on modernism or modern art in India have tended actually to emphasize Indian art's difference or deviation from practices in the West.
Sure.
So to suggest that, for example, Nandalal Bose
Right.
is a modern artist, but not, or for some, Jamini Roy. Actually, Nandalal Bose is the better example, but Nandalal Bose being a modern artist, but not a modernist in a Western sense.
Right.
Parthamitra, of course, makes the provocative argument that Jamini Roy's practice, which many have thought of as anti-modernist or traditionalist, can actually be understood as a kind of primitivist modernism. So these are the arguments that placed Indian modern art in opposition to developments in the West is a literature that I was keen to address. That literature, I think, played a very important role in the 80s and 90s in terms of excavating a set of practices and practitioners that we hadn't really been able to accommodate within certainly Eurocentric narratives of modern art. So everyone from Ravi Verma to Nandalal Bose, who you can't really slot into our existing narratives. For that matter, the artists that I treat in this book can't be easily slotted into a kind of a Western narrative, but they certainly understood their project as national and international. The worldly of the book's title has multiple meanings and registers of meaning. So it certainly does refer to the arguments of Said and Spivak that you referenced. It also actually refers to these artists' response to the Bengal School, a movement that was prominent in the first decades of the 20th century and that
and critique of it.
It was a critique of it. That movement, one could say, valorized an otherworldliness, Indian art spirituality, as Tapatu Gautarkar has argued.
So secularism. And it's also, you talk
so
about
this
secularism.
is a materialist turn. This
Yeah.
is a materialist turn, and this is a secular turn. Yes. And this is a turn that these artists who are quite different from each other share. They're artists who are all clearly, or rather I shouldn't say clearly, but are canonical figures in India and associated with the project of modernism, but not necessarily with each other or with any school or movement per se. They are somewhat independent, if not iconoclastic. And it was important to me to think about how each of these artists' practice performs what you described as a being in the world, but also a making of the world that is Indian to the extent that it is a specific, situated response to colonialism.
So it's only because of its situatedness that makes it Indian. Because it seems to me your argument really is that this reading is a way to rethink modernist practice in general.
Yes, that's correct.
Correct?
Correct. There is an argument from this archive. I am staging a kind of dialectic, a dialectical process between what you might describe as developments at a national level and developments at a global or transnational level.
Right.
And then, yes, the next phase of the argument, and many other scholars really, this is kind of where they have picked up, is to use this idea in different kinds of post-colonial situations, non-Western or post-colonial situations.
Or what about Western situations?
That has happened so far a little bit less.
But would you argue that whether it has happened or not? Would you argue that it needs to be also identified in Western situations?
A kind of a dialectic between national and global modernism, absolutely. However, I will say that there are certain features of modernism in India that have in common features with modernism in Latin America and Africa that are distinct from European and US modernisms. Now, I'll say specifically this. I say the relationship to the past, which is to say that modernism in the West has been largely understood, and even though our narratives of this, so-called Western modernism are shifting, has been understood as a rejection, a rhetorical rejection, a practical rejection of the past, a kind of breaking with illusionistic representation since the Renaissance. In many ways, post-colonial modernisms were very invested in a project of, if not recovery and recuperation, certainly a reclamation of the past. So in India, you can see that through a turn to classical art like Ajanta, or to the quote-unquote primitive art of the folk, of the village, of the world of craft.
Sure, okay.
And so this turn to a national cultural past, even though it is mythical and in itself a modern invention, is common to modernisms in Mexico, in India, and elsewhere.
But how would you articulate Gauguin and sort of their sort of also look at primitivism, whatever they call primitivism and
Gauguin's primitivism. Very important for many Indian artists to think through as a project, but of course Gauguin's relationship to his subjects was different as the European master in relation to, let's say, Tahitian women who were his models is a rather different relationship than the one that my artists have to, let's say, their models and materials.
Okay.
It's a relationship, of course, that Shergill is actually very self-consciously critical of in Self-Portrait as Tahitian.
Yeah, that's right.
So I would say that's a self-conscious and proto-post-colonial critique of Gauguin.
That's how you argue
and of Gauguin's primitivism.
Amrita Shergill, that she's both influenced and sort of critiques it also.
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
But to return to what you were saying, you were articulating an affiliation between the post-colonial nations. Particularly in your book, you certainly quote Octavia Paz a lot, and of course, he was ambassador to India, and so there's a sort of a very direct connection. But you were trying to say that there is a post-colonial affiliation that is to be distinguished from received general normative readings of the construction of Western modernism, yes?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I would say this. I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's a relationship of complete or total difference. For example, the Parthar Chatterjee argument of around the post-colony, and I'm forgetting this kind of slim volume where this argument is presented, but there's a kind of post-colonial difference, or an extreme version of post-colonial difference that Chatterjee argues that is not as far as I would go in terms of arguing for the kind of history of cosmopolitan that I'm arguing.
Right.
At the same time, I wouldn't say that the history of cosmopolitanism or the history of modernism that I present in this book can be easily transplanted or translated to any location, whether it's Mexico or Senegal or Japan. I think there are ideas and influences that certainly these societies share. I also think you're absolutely right that there needs to be a more nuanced and critical reckoning with European artists' borrowings from elsewhere.
Yes.
And Partha Mitra, of course, makes a very important intervention there with his argument around the Picasso-Manqué syndrome, the idea that Gaganendranath Tagore is seen to be derivative of Picasso, but Picasso is never derivative of, let's say, African art.
Yeah.
So why is it that this kind of exchange goes only one way? Ming Tianpo has made a very similar argument about cultural influence seeming to always only go one way from Europe to Japan and not the other way around, even though we know that not to be the case. Her term for this kind of theory of exchange is cultural mercantilism. And so these are, these scholars really laid the groundwork for what I would do in this book. I do think the problem, there is a problem or a risk with trying to present the relationship between, let's say, India and Britain or India and the West as symmetrical, that the West borrows from India, India borrows from the West. I think that those kinds of narratives or theories of exchange tend to flatten out relations of power. Yeah. And profound asymmetries that the artists are aware of and quite frankly are registered in the work.
Sure.
You can see in Shergill's treatment of Gauguin, in Hussein's citation of Paul Klee, in Subramanian's citation or borrowing from Henri Matisse, in Bhupin Kakar's citation or borrowing of David Hockney or Bruegel, who he loved, or Kitai, even, right. Not exactly a contemporary, but say a roughly contemporary artist. These artists acknowledge the differential in power and in representation with artists in the West, and it's visible in the works of art. There's an irony, there's a mimicry in some of the works that is very self-aware about that relation. And that, I would say, is actually quite particular to this archive. It's not necessarily, I don't think you're going to find colonial ambivalence, mimicry, or hybridity, to use Homi Bhabha's words, in the works of most European or US artists of the same period.
But we won't find it, but perhaps we have to look for a different...
We have to look for some other modality of
yeah.
Yes,
because
right.
Otherwise, how does affiliation work? While there is obviously asymmetries of power, and those have to be acknowledged, and those are also acknowledged, for instance, in the case of Maqbool Fida Hussain looking at the rural landscape, or Amrita Shergill looking at the South India or whatever. No, yes. So asymmetries abound everywhere. And everyone, or any good art practitioner, is always constructing around that, correct?
Yes, yes.
But we find, so you very well described, so when the Indian artists are looking at the rural situation and channeling Gandhi, they are aware of their privilege.
Yes.
So similarly, one would imagine one can produce a reading of privilege in the West.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's not the project of this book, but yes,
no.
It does open the door for that. Affiliation is an idea that I hope carries across. It is a notion, as you put it quite well, of cultivation.
Right.
Against organic or inherited identities and practices that's drawn from Edward Said's writing on the subject.
Okay.
So most of Said's archive was European or Western literature.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
So
yes.
You can certainly, use the post. I mean, I derive that post-colonial critique to use, with a different project. I will also say, Vikram, I think this will, I don't know if this is going to be necessarily useful for your podcast listeners, but I think certainly you're aware of the critique also of the success of post-colonial theory in the West, which is to say, for some scholars, whether it was subaltern studies or post-colonial studies, India became the model for the post-colonial world.
Sure, yeah.
And I was it became hegemonic in its own way.
Yeah.
And so I was very careful with this book that I didn't want to reproduce that dynamic, which is to say, as Partha Chatterjee did in his pioneering books of the 80s, which is to say a derivative discourse, for example, and lay out a theory of the post-colonial world or post-colonial politics, as he continues to do. And it's an admirable project, but I don't want to go there. One, I think it essentializes post-colonial difference and the post-colony.
Yeah.
I think it reproduces the hegemonic status of India.
Yeah.
I do think that India is a particularly rich site to think about modernism. I think that the archives are really quite astonishing and diverse, even though you don't always find them where you're looking for them.
In Almira, as you said.
That's what I said, yes. And the artists that I write about, it's funny because I've had to say this again and again. They're canonical figures and there's been a ton written about them. And I chose them specifically for that reason. They are not marginal or outliers in any way. And there are generations of people writing on them.
Right.
So by the time I'm writing on Hussein's Man,
right.
I have 50 years of criticism on Hussein's Man.
Yeah.
And which makes these artists particularly good subjects, to rethink historiographies of national and global modernism. And so, again, there were lots of advantages to thinking about these particular careers. These artists have also, as you know, been over-determined in many ways and continue to be so, as woman artist, queer artist, Muslim artist, craftsman or Brahmin, whatever you like.
And you steered away from that
deliberately. And I decided that that's not what I want to do. I acknowledge the importance of those kinds of historiographies, but I want to be able to tell a different story that actually relates to some of my own intellectual and political commitments, but that also gives us a different, defamiliarizes, let's put it this way, the received stories of modernism in India, which, whether they're the pre or post 1947, or they're the story of modernism in the visual arts that's separate from modernism in theater, that's separate from modernism in literature and architecture, or the story of modernism in Bengal and Baroda and Madras being kind of different modernisms. So this was a way of thinking about a national modernism, but also the artificiality of that conceit, and yet at the same time how dear it was to the practitioners of this.
And their struggle with it.
That's right.
It's their production of it and being reproduced.
And I've been critiqued now, both in person and print, a great deal for having reified the canon and valorized the nation. And of course, I keep pointing to the fact that it was actually a conscious gesture to have, the nation state is not necessarily the nation of this modernism, which is the nation that emerges in the 30s, is an inchoate form, is a horizon of possibility. And that it's not a coincidence that the first two images in the book are a map of South Asia and then Zarina Hashmi's absolutely abstract rendering of country.
You describe it, did not perform a movement toward freedom, but announced the imperfect, uneasy arrival of liberal democracy.
That's right. And, I was very keen that the images on the cover and in between the covers actually tell the story, not of a kind of triumphal arrival into, or triumphal arrival into freedom, but of something that was uneasy, ambivalent, dark,
shaky,
conflicted. Absolutely. And so I kept saying to the publisher, the image must be dark. So Bhupen Kakkar's images, Shergill's images are often produced, quite frankly, as precisely the kinds of tourist pictures that they were critiquing. So Shergill did not want to present, this was present in her own writing, a rosy picture of village India. She wanted a realist picture, a critical picture of village India and therefore of India. Often the way the images are reproduced in terms of color and cropping and so on presents them as poster views. Kakkar was very self-conscious about appropriating calendar art and the art of the bazaar. It's not an uncritical celebration of this art, but it's a kind of critique of middle-class values, of class, of caste, and so on. And so it was very important to me that the book have their works reproduced in color and reproduced in a way that you would see them speaking to each other and to historical archive, works from the 19th century and before, photographs, prints, paintings, and also give a sense of the kind of uneasiness.
Okay. Well, this book certainly carries that, and you have to be congratulated for the production of it. It's a beautifully produced book. So, but I want to come and push you a little bit on and let you pick up on a couple of other things. When you describe affiliation, and this may connect to perhaps what you were referring to as your intellectual and political interests, but I felt very strongly that affiliation was set up in a way that strongly empowered the agency of the artist.
Yes.
But at one point, I think towards the conclusion, you also talked about affiliation, and you used the term as an infection. Yeah, if I knew the page number.
I would love to know this.
Yes.
This doesn't sound, infection, disease, organic metaphor is not usually my thing.
Yeah, but it made me think that affiliation, which seems to suggest I come and stand next to you and affiliate, is also simultaneously driven. There is also, in a lot of the things you were describing, a kind of obsession. I just have to do this. As if you're driven to do this. and a kind of a, it's not like everything is sort of agential. It's also being done to you. I mean,
Yes.
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 So
Well,
there is sort of an obsession and kind of to add, you're into Benjamin's ruins very much, but Benjamin also has the angel of history, right? And one can adduce that idea that when you look at history and you look at your contemporary, there's also this pathos and kind of obsession about, what do I do with this? But I'm taken by it. Right? So it's a two-way process, isn't it?
yes, I think you're actually very astute, and I wish I could remember the exact sentence, but I think it's somewhere in the first chapter where I say something like, these artists understood that freedom would have to be obtained from existing structures. But one of the things that I was very keen to emphasize, so yes, the artist's agency and intention is really important to me. Choices that they're making about identity and group and movement and so on, very, very important. At the same time, I did not want to present this as a history merely of heroic individuals and iconoclasts.
Okay,
So
yes.
the structures of the art world, which is to say a system of galleries, exhibitions, criticisms. Each chapter actually to some extent addresses the question of the patronage for art, the public for art, controversies around each of the artists' work, how that work was received in the period in which it was produced, and to actually say that what we're seeing, so in some sense that the artists are not quote unquote free agents. They may be striving toward certain kinds of freedom.
Sure.
But they are constrained. They are constrained not only by colonialism, but they're constrained by nationalism. So in the chapter on Hussein, for example, in the section on the film, Through the Eyes of a Painter,
Right.
you've seen how the state's films division of India produces films in which the village is featured in particular kinds of
Right.
ways.
Yeah.
And
You had all the numbers
certain
of the various
categories.
types of
Right, various types of films, various categories, and
That
so
was
on.
fascinating.
And so, the artists are working in that structure. Hussein is commissioned by the Films Division of
Yeah.
India, and yet he makes an experimental film that actually critiques lots of their categories and understandings of culture.
Okay. Now I understand. Obviously, agencies produced within institutional
Structures.
infrastructures.
Yes.
Let's say.
Yes.
But I'm also referring to a little bit more where agency is not a sort of karta kind of doing.
It's a
but
compulsion.
It's a compulsion.
So yes, I do think, here's what I will say. Okay, so I think I understand where you're going with this argument. So I did want to emphasize that, and I understand that that wasn't exactly your question, but that it was important to me to write an institutional history of this art world.
Of
so that
course.
we can't take things like the gallery,
Yeah.
the dealer, the critic
Yeah.
for granted.
Yeah.
And that, who would be the patron for art? Who would be the public for art? That these are
Sure.
constantly kind of in question. How would artists be trained? What would be the school for art? If it wasn't going to be the JJ school and it wasn't going to be Shantiniketan, what could and should an art school
And
look
you
like?
need JJ to be set up as the bad guy also.
Right. And then Shantiniketan. So then Baroda can follow as a critique of Shantiniketan,
Right.
and so on and so forth, right? So that, again, dialectic, the way that history moves is something that was very important to me. But I think the argument that you're seizing on is one that I make in the first and last chapters of the book about how contemporary artists have turned to the past, to an inheritance of modernism as a kind of compulsion.
Yeah.
That this is that this engagement with the past that we see has, by the 21st century, for various reasons, become a tradition in the art world. But it's also an essential feature and function of contemporary art that's relatively neglected. So lots of histories of contemporary art, of India and elsewhere, are written as though the world began in 1989.
Oh, really?
Or in
Yeah,
the
yes,
Indian
you
case is
mentioned that. Yes,
1991.
Yeah.
That there was no world, and so the contemporary artists,
It's Oedipal, isn't it?
It's bizarre that there's a tabula rasa, or that there's no engagement with the past, and yet it seems to me that so many significant practices and practitioners of the 21st century are returning obsessively, you're right, to excavate a history of modernism. I hadn't put it together, but you could also say that Subramanian's turn and Hussein's before him and Shergill's before him to the village was a kind of compulsion But, you know, at some level, I think that we have to kind of balance out personal compulsions of individual artists, let's say, with ethical and political commitments that are structural, that are historical.
Modernism can be said to be an international compulsion by the late 19th and early 20th century. That's a good question, or that's a good provocation. Also, not only.
Yes.
Is it not useful to deconstruct the opposition between agency and compulsion?
Yes. I think that's a useful... You mean to say that some kind of modernism was in the air by the 1930s? Yes.
And you're sort of infected by it, and there's not, you know, you sort of do it, but it's not like, you know, you're...
Well, here's what I will say. For every period of Indian art that I examine in this book, just like every period of Western art, you can find anti-modernist counterexamples. So this book is not a comprehensive history
of course not.
Modern art or modernism, and that in each period, I mean, heck, up to the 60s or 70s and maybe beyond, you're probably going to find some kind of Bengal school
of course.
Yeah. And some kind of traditionalist or anti-modernist forces, movements, groups are always kind of in place and offering a critique. That's not the history that I present. But if you're talking about a participation and participation in a global culture of modernism, even by artists who didn't leave India until they were, fully mature practitioners, a kind of sense of modernism in the air, like Hussain, like Kakkar.
Yeah, Kakkar and Subramaniam left earlier, Paris.
He did go earlier. He went to London. Yeah. Yes, he went to the Slade.
Yeah.
So Subramaniam went earlier. Shergill, of course, was also trained.
And Maqbool Hussain was sort of, one would argue, pushed out.
But none of the training. Yes, none of the early years. And actually, the funny thing about Hussain that we forget, he achieved success relatively early, which is to say, like in the 50s, or one could say in the 50s, mid-50s. He was a very successul artist. By 1954, when he was representing India at Venice and so on. But he was, by that point, in his 40s.
Oh, right. Okay, but let's return to this idea of, this infection, the denial of modernism.
The denial.
Denial of modernism by the whoever is constructing the post-89 narratives, including the narrators.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so, and what I'm reading you say, the denial, therefore you find the obsession because it's then hidden.
Yes.
And you describe it, you use two terms which I think are very interesting to me. One, you say that you see the ruins of modernism everywhere.
Yes.
Which sort of ties in with even the sort of right-wing narrative of Nehruvian age. It's in ruins. But then you also talk about the ruins as being haunted. And in your last chapter, you use the word haunted like at least twice.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So what is this haunting?
What is this about? Okay, so this is a different way of telling history. It's a way of telling history that's indebted to Walter Benjamin and the Arcades Project. It's a way of narrating India's break, let's say, with a socialist past and a kind of entry into neoliberal economic reforms and a global economy in 1991. But that does not present that moment of arrival and entry in triumphalist terms or as a total rupture. Just as I would say 1947 is a significant political moment, but not a complete break with the past. So too is 1991 or 1989, if you want to think about it that way. Certainly a break with the past, but not a total rupture. And so the idea of the ruin helps me think about transition, or Benjamin's idea of the ruin helps me think about transition. I would not argue that the contemporary artists I'm writing about are modernists themselves. I think they're very self-conscious of their citation of modernism as not a project that's relegated to the past, but that is a project associated with the past, and that it's a past that has value and efficacy that can be reanimated, which is how the haunting idea comes out. So the idea that the ruin can be activated for the present, as it is for Benjamin, and to think about this, think about the archives and artifacts of the past as having potential.
No, reactivated is again very agential. Haunting is something that happens to you in spite of yourself.
I see. So no, I think the argument I have about haunting is that there is a kind of specter, if you want to call it that. Specter.
Specter. Oh, another ghostly
ghost. There's a specter of modernism in many of the works that we're looking at that has been neglected. Yeah. But that's different than saying that the artists are, I'm very careful about, I don't know if this is true in architecture, but art history has a tendency, it's a very old-fashioned tendency to present all artists as conflicted geniuses or isolated individuals.
Which artists happen to promote, as you saw in that picture, M.F. Hussain,
or, as being kind of heroic and tragic and haunted. And that I want to be very careful, that's not the haunting or the compulsion.
No, that's not the haunting we're talking about.
That's not the haunting or compulsion.
We're talking about the haunting of modernism as a cultural practice, sort of that captures a lot of people in the net. As a critic,
yes. So here's what I will say. I will not say that any of these artists are personally haunted by modernism, but that we can think that haunting is a very effective way to think about the work of the past on the present. And it's a metaphor that's being used widely in the humanities at this moment. It's certainly not new to, or it's not unique to this moment, but it is, of course, being widely used. I do think as a cultural critic, that would be my stand. Rather than to say the artists are being haunted, as someone who is writing about this work, I will say the work is haunted. And I think we need to think about the way in which this work is inhabited by the past or animated by the past as a kind of haunting. So that's my contribution or intervention.
So let's dig down into that and get more specific.
Okay.
So what is it that haunts you?
Me personally? After all this talk about no personal haunting?
What are your hauntings that have pulled you into this work? Why are you doing this? Why are you interested in this this modernism and this story of modernism? How did you get into it? I mean, and don't tell me there was this amazing seminar at Berkeley.
Oh, no. I wanted to do this work before I got to Berkeley. So the honest answer, and it's actually a very academic answer, but I do have other answers as well, I suppose, that came along the way, or I wouldn't have stayed with it. It seemed to me when I was deciding to go to graduate school that a lot of very exciting work was happening in thinking about modern South Asia. But that a lot of the work on visual culture was coming from fields like sociology, anthropology, history, and so on, and that there wasn't a lot of writing. So Chris Pinney's Camera Indica had been out for a couple of years. There were people beginning to work on calendar art, photography. Of course, film studies has been around for longer than that. But it seemed to me that people weren't really looking at what we would perhaps call elite art, painting and sculpture, modernist forms.
So you're filling a gap, is that what you're saying?
So no, it seemed to me that there was something, no, it wasn't a gap so much. It was like, wow, there's an archive here that hasn't been addressed at all, and that actually is quite compelling and quite strange. From a personal point of view, artists like Shergill and Kakkar, who I had always wanted, whose work I'd been drawn to, who I'd wanted to write about, were also at the time, it's hard to believe now that they've been the subject of retrospectives at major Western museums.
Right.
But when I began this work, it seemed to me that their art was distant, illegible, and potentially untranslatable given contemporary politics. Sure. Not just the politics of the academy, but again, the interest in contemporary art that I narrate in the book. Which is to say that there was a kind of erasure of everything that had come before. And so I was often asked by Indians, why are you interested in this? Or what is there a value in this archive?
Right.
And it seemed to me that the very strangeness of that archive, its apparent distance from our moment, was a very intriguing conceptual and intellectual problem.
But so when did you first learn of Amrita Shergill? How old were you? What were you doing?
I wish I could tell you.
I mean,
It's not.
last you remember.
Unfortunately, it's not like the Kennedy assassination. I can't tell you where I was.
Yeah.
I think I have been probably conscious of Shergill since I was certainly a young woman, maybe in my teens. I think I probably grew more interested in her as
Do you remember when
a work of art?
Did you
first
did you
see a
see
work?
her?
No, I wish I could tell you. No,
When did you first see? Did you see a picture of her or a book or a?
I could not tell you that. That said, Vikram, it's amazing to me after I've written the book that I have, and I'm very careful to say, and I don't remember if I say it in this book, but I've said it in other things. Shergill is not like Frida Kahlo in the sense of having that kind of national or international stature. You know, she's not
It's
known.
amazing to me.
She's not known like to people on the street. At the same time, in a certain kind of middle class culture in India, she's everywhere.
She's everywhere.
She's everywhere. She's on poster. I go to people's homes and there's a poster of Shergill, and you wouldn't even believe it. Or people have heard of her, or I go to an art fair and someone tells me about a connection to the family. You know, she's not someone who appears on magnets and pins and things like that. But it is interesting how, and I was in Lahore for the first time last year, where Saloni Mathur gave a presentation on Shergill, thinking in some ways or imagining perhaps that Shergill had been forgotten in that city. And that was nowhere near the case. You know, I mean, I don't think that people are doing scholarship or producing academic histories of Shergill in Lahore, but there's a way that she, among, again, a certain kind of educated art world and maybe academic audience, she lives.
Oh, she was big. I mean, I remember my first Iqbal Singh came home and he was driving a new car, and I don't know who it was. I was a kid. He said, you know, he sold one Amrita Shergill drawing, and he's bought this car, and that impressed me immensely. I was like, who's Amrita Shergill? And that's how.
Or, you know, I will say, Vikram, I feel like Shergill was being, again, inhabits a certain kind of middle class or academic imagination in ways that I really wanted this book to oppose, which is to say, the biographical Shergill.
Sure.
There are innumerable Shergill biographies. That
oh, really? I only
there's
know
many.
two. Yeah. Okay.
Dalmia, Iqbal
must be
Singh.
new ones.
Yeah, there are many Shergill biographies. There's an industry of Shergill
Is that right?
admirers
well,
and
she's
biographies.
very attractive subject.
Well, you know, there's
you know,
that.
tragic,
and that,
absolutely.
And there's also a way in which you could easily recuperate her into a certain kind of feminist history.
Yeah.
So I've actually written a separate essay in which I describe Shergill's career as being intelligible under what one scholar has called the Plath problem, after Sylvia Plath.
Okay, sure.
To say that, why do we narrate female careers in this way? That said, there's this biographical cottage industry around her, some of which has been propagated by the estate and by her nephew, who is a practicing artist. There's a way in which a lot of her archive, I mean, she occupies an interesting place because the majority of her work is in the collection of the National Gallery of Modern Art in New Delhi.
Right.
An astonishing majority, by which I mean, you know, there's just a handful, you know, maybe 10 to 40 works, depending on what you count as works, not sketches when she was 6. You know, that are actually there. So mostly it's in the collection of the National Gallery of Modern Art, but her letters, her papers, her photographs are all in private hands. So it has made it very difficult for anyone to do, quote unquote, proper academic research.
So there isn't a consolidated archive.
There isn't an archive that's available to scholars or has been. So that was one Shergill I wanted to write against. On the other hand, there's been people who've written on Shergill or spoken about Shergill as Shahid Amin did when he released his, when he re-released the book with a revised edition. All this kind of insider knowledge and laughter about Shergill and speculation about Shergill's affairs. So Shergill's relationship to Nehru and Shergill's relationship to various other elite men and women of Indian society at that time. And there was a level at which I had no interest in whether Shergill, you know, slept with Nehru or didn't sleep with Nehru. We wouldn't ask this question of Subramanian, Kakkar, or Hussain. And in fact, Hussain had certainly a very active and colorful sex life that somehow seems immaterial to everyone
Nobody
who's
writes
written on
about
his
that?
art. Not very many people. He makes his own films about this, you know, about his romances. But it's not really the subject of writing the way, for example, Shergill's life is. And to some extent, Khakkar's sexuality has definitely been the subject of a lot of writing,
Because of queer.
but not in the same biographical mode, which seems to be a woman artist problem, I think, and maybe particular to Shergill as well. So I wanted to actually write a book which, you know, and you can see that the problems are amplified with the Shergill case or example, but I wanted to write a book in which we're actually paying attention to the work, which is to say Shergill's work, Hussein's work, Khakkar's work, Subramanian's work, not their, I don't know, their family lives and, you know, romantic struggles and such.
So a feminist kind of move.
Oh, absolutely.
And is that one of the reasons why we don't get to see a picture of Amrita Shergill in the beginning of the chapter?
It's the last. It's the last picture in the book.
The sort of the revisions. The sort of I mean, those are collages, aren't they?
No, but they are based on historical photographs.
Original pictures. Yeah, I know. Amrita Shergill's pictures are historical. I mean, they are
right. So yes, yes, it was a very conscious gesture.
All the other chapters you begin with photographs of the artist, but not Amrita Shergill.
Well, and the portrait of the artist, you get two of her self-portraits and a detailed discussion of self-portraits. So yes, absolutely, it was a very self-conscious feminist strategy, and I didn't want to deny the reader. So this is actually an issue that's come up with the Nasreen Mohammadi exhibition at the Met Breuer. The curator, Sheena Wagstaff, said in a public discussion that I was a part of, there's a recording online, that she did not want a photograph of Mohammadi and have her be orientalized or exoticized as an Indian woman wearing a sari, teaching, etc., etc. She wanted her to stand as a global modernist and somehow efface.
Is that what you also wanted?
No. When I gave the talk at the Met, I showed a picture of Mohammadi teaching in a classroom. I thought it was incredibly important to her artist. Oh, so with Shergill in this book, my strategy was that one, images of Shergill proliferate. To be honest, there were some practical concerns as well, because one of the possibilities for the cover of the book was a Shergill painting. And there's been a lot of now work on and about Shergill. So I had a limited number of images that I could illustrate in color in the book. And so I wasn't going to deny the reader a view of Shergill, but I knew it was going to come at the end.
Okay.
So it was going to be Shergill's looking back at you. We started with Shergill, we ended with Shergill.
But those are Vivan Sundaram's constructions.
But they are based on, I mean, it's an actual portrait of the artist. It's not a, you know, it's not a fiction. The other thing, Vikram, that I think that you are astute enough to know, and that has been really under-recognized in reviews of the book, which have been actually very thoughtful, much more thoughtful than I would have anticipated. Not just positive, but actually constructive in many ways. Is that very few people have understood or fully understood the intervention in terms of beginning and ending a history of modernism in India with Shergill. Because histories of modernism in India today, including at the Asia Society show that took place last fall, in which I participated in a public program, begin with the progressive artists, who are all male. And they end with all male artists. And there's a way in which Shergill is just, it's the strangest thing possible. She is absolutely central to histories of modernism and is never structurally placed at the center of any account of Indian modernism.
That's amazing.
She's just an outsider and an iconoclast.
You will have histories because she's a woman?
Yes, of course. Jamini. So, for example, Partha Mitter's book places Jamini Roy and Gaganendranath Tagore at the center of his account of modernism. And he has a right to do this on any kind of aesthetic or political or historical or cultural basis. But Amrita Shergill is relegated to a chapter with Sunayani Devi as women artists who struggled with their, you know, personal lives and careers to make it as women artists. Shergill was absolutely, and this is not my contention, every artist from Hussein to Hebar to Souza, you know, no feminist there in that group acknowledge Shergill's debt and influence. You cannot have a history. It's not a 21st century phenomenon to say Shergill is an important figure. And yet, she is not placed structurally, institutionally, culturally in dialogue with her peers. Binod Bihari Mukherjee, Ram Kinkar Bej, on the figure of the village, on the figure of the primitive, on the figure of woman. These critical dialogues that are happening among men in Bengal. And yet every major modernist in the 20th century, will acknowledge Shergill, but our histories don't do it.
Right.
So
there is a heroine in the story then.
Well, it's very funny that you say that, because I've had one very astute reader, Lalita Gopalan, say to me that really your fifth artist or hero is Geeta Kapoor.
Oh yeah,
Because in some
you
sense,
love Geeta Kapoor.
This
That's
is
for
this
sure.
is the history of Geeta Kapoor, right? This is as much a history
I
of.
made a list of your favorites over here, but I'll read that to you some other
But I
time.
will
you like
say,
Tapti Guha Thakur
Thakur, I do. No, these are
your big
foundational.
readers.
Yeah, these
you
are
read them
foundational
carefully,
figures
yeah.
to a history of modernism. But at the same time, for me, Kapoor, and this is very important, she's a figure in this history. I'm not writing about her as though she's a contemporary intellectual weighing in.
Yeah, no.
She's a participant in this history.
Yeah, no,
she is like Bartholomew for me.
Oh, yeah.
She's not someone. Guha Thakur is an academic. She's a
Yeah.
senior academic,
Yeah.
but I am writing with her with a particular distance from the objects of our study. Kapoor, to me, is very much a part of this art world of which I write.
Right.
So it's very difficult. So each chapter, and this was less visible to some readers and more visible to others, each chapter actually pairs the artist with a critic. So Shergill and Charles Fabry, Hussain and Bartholomew,
Okay.
Subramanian and Shiv Kumar,
Okay.
and then Kakkar and Kapoor. And these are artists and critics who kind of came of age together.
I
And so there's a way in which, again, so as I said, the institutions of the art world, the emergence of, I focus less on dealers, but certainly, for example, state patronage is a big, state patronage, the role of the art school is a big theme in the book, or a running theme in the book. And so that goes back to your original point about continuity with change.
Yeah. So as we move towards the end here, so let me get your opinion on one thing, and then nitpick a little thing with you. You end with the Kochi Biennale, and you start with the Indian Pavilion in
Venice.
the Venice Biennale. And several times you refer to the sort of explosion of dollar interest in the Indian art market, right? So what do you think about this? Is this a long time coming, or is this crazy? What's going on in the Indian
have to
art
say,
market?
I'm not opposed to the commercial interest in Indian art. What I do feel was missing for a large period or for a long period, I should say, was a critical interest in this art. What is this art saying and doing beyond the money it's making?
Let's take the money. I want to continue that. So you're not opposed. You think it's a great idea?
What? That the market is burgeoning, or is this?
Yeah.
No, I think that the speculation. During the art market boom between 2004 and 2008 was, I think that speculation was generative and destructive, as booms and busts can be and tend to be.
Sure.
I think they've also been the subject of a lot of academic writing at this point. And to me, the art market, which is certainly important to the changes that we've seen in the last 20 years or 25 years, is only one part of the story. To me, I think the other part of the story that's been left out, and the market has certainly played a role in that as well, is the changes in institutions, in exhibitions. So, for example, new museums and galleries coming up, new exhibitions like the Kochi Biennale, new artistic networks emerging, artist collectives, artist associations emerging in South Asia, not just in India, and the changed artistic language and practice.
All for the better?
I think it's a much bigger world than it
Bigger
was
is better?
for the modernists that I write about. I think that in ways that are, I think it's a world that's extremely uneven and hierarchical, but in which questions of democracy and difference are being asked and addressed in new ways than they were in the modernist art world. So
we are
yes,
grateful.
I'm a modernist at heart. I will say that there are lots of, let me put it this way. I think that the commitments to citizenship, the commitments to big ideas, the nation, or to big projects, internationalism, I think those are now in question, and that makes me sometimes a little sad. I don't think that all contemporary art is bad or commercial or uncritical, but I do think that that the best contemporary art is engaged with the history of modernism and asking critical questions about the future of the art world, which includes the public for art, which includes the role of the artist as a kind of citizen.
Sure. I mean, I thought that you sort of were going to string up the Kochi Biennale, but then you rescued it. And so I've sensed a little bit of ambivalence in there.
I am ambivalent about contemporary art. Yes, I'm ambivalent about contemporary art. Sometimes I feel, like my colleague Marek Wieczorek has said, like an interloper in the world of contemporary art, even though this is the art of my time. I am.
But you are protesting strongly in the darbar of contemporary art and its claimed disavowal of modernism.
I certainly am. And I'm actually saying that, there's a lot of great, smart contemporary art being made at this moment, and that we haven't fully understood its implications, resonances, affiliations, and that's a project that awaits.
So talking about affiliations, you're happy to use the wonderful architectural metaphor of ruins.
I know where this is going.
But architecture really doesn't find much place anywhere
in the book.
The book, you haven't even written about the Hussein Doshi Gufa. But you celebrated Hussein's, translations between film and so on and so forth. Well, what do you think about the Hussein Doshi Gufa? Let's just
let
cut
me
to the
say,
chase.
there are many elisions and occlusions in the book for which
sure.
I feel very guilty. The closest I got to anything around architecture was the mural movement of the 60s and the idea of environments or artists working in city spaces. I discussed Gujral briefly, and of course he turned to architectural work
later in his life.
Later in his life. I will say that I think the history of modernism, for which I have done some recompense in the years after this book was published, has to be written differently and as an interdisciplinary project that, let's just say, a first book for a US tenure process made it impossible to do.
Okay.
So I have now started to write, I've published now one article on the relationship between artistic modernisms and literary modernisms, painters and poets in Bombay in the 60s and 70s, and another on modernism in the performing arts and modernism in the visual arts in the 30s and 40s in Almora around Uday Shankar Center.
But to return to
so
my
maybe
question,
someday I'll get to architecture.
You have seen the Hussein Doshi Gufa.
I have.
And what do you think of it?
I think that it's an experiment. I think there were a lot of complicated and revealing experiments. They don't have to be necessarily the greatest works of art. So for example, I encouraged students I've encouraged my students on numerous occasions to write about Hussein's films if they can bear to sit through them. That is not to say through the eyes of a painter, but the Meenakshi and so on. I said, Hussein is a brilliant imagist. The visual images are just stunning, but he can't do character or the film just falls apart as a film. And I said, if you can sit through the 3 hours, I would love to read something smart about this work. But I do think that, to quote one of my colleagues who works on Renaissance art historians are often interested, I was telling my students this too, on moments of, or art historians are often drawn to and interested in moments of transition and of failure. Personally, the failure reveals a lot more than the work that is slick, polished, successful. So that was my attention, that was the reason for my interest, in part, in Hussein's film.
Okay.
Through the Eyes of the Painter is a very...
You think that's a failure? I don't think
No, but it's a rudimentary and kind of utterly brilliant film.
Right. But you think Hussein Doshi Gufa is possibly a failure?
Yes, indeed.
Well,
on
that point.
On the record.
On the record. On that point, Sonal, thank you for this conversation. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.